The daily avalanche of legitimate news from cable TV, social media, and endless websites often includes news reports that look real but are actually jokes or hoaxes and propaganda. Given the volume of news available, how can the average person separate fact from fiction?
There were several fatalities at the scene, both students and staff.
The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting shocked the country, and for a moment, like other tragic events in our recent history, brought the country together. Unfortunately, it didn't take long before Alex Jones, the founder of InfoWars, began to peddle a conspiracy theory about the shooting. Jones has repeatedly claimed the massacre was a giant hoax carried out by crisis actors in a broad scheme to trample on Second Amendment rights. Whether Jones' actions were motivated by greed, malice, or as he later claimed, psychosis, his story exposed the risks of misinformation in a deeply divided environment where the breaking news cycle is thriving and tech companies control how we receive and distribute information.
Two families of children who died in the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary shooting are now suing radio host Alex Jones for defamation. The controversial host of InfoWars has long suggested the media faked information about the shooting.
They staged Sandy Hook. The evidence is just overwhelming. It took me about a year with Sandy Hook to come to grips with the fact that the whole thing was fake.
It's almost political theater. It's, agit-prop kind of performance art in the most bastardized and sadistic way.
They've got the kids going in circles in and out of the building with their hands up. I've watched the footage, and it looks like a drill.
Ultimately, someone like Alex Jones, given the architecture of the internet, is probably going to make more money as an outrage influencer than he would as a small local news organization. It's not actually about children anymore. It's stripped of any notes of empathy or sympathy or cognitive understanding about how things happen. But what happens is there's an alternate framing that attempts to make sense out of, an event in a way that fits their own worldview.
Given how crazy this stuff seems, why is it that people could come to believe it? Shouldn't our reasoning abilities allow us to see that this content is obviously not true? This classic effect from cognitive psychology called the illusory truth effect is the finding that just hearing a statement repeated makes it seem more plausible. We have people read some stories, then do some distractor task, fill out some random surveys for 5 minutes, and then we have them rate the accuracy of a bigger set of stories, some of which we showed them in the beginning and some of which we didn't, and they rate the ones that we showed them at the beginning as more accurate than the ones that don't. If they hadn't seen the headline before, about 18% of the headlines got rated as true. But if they had just been shown it 5 minutes earlier, that went up to 24%. When it comes to the kind of partisan misinformation that circulates on social media, which is what we've been focusing on, it's really not that reasoning powers are getting hijacked, it's just that people are not bothering to reason in the first place. And people are just kind of going with their intuitive gut responses. And what we found is when people stop and think a little bit more, they're actually substantially better at telling what's true versus false.
One perspective of fake news when it comes to democracy is that it's just about electoral manipulation, that it's about duping voters and trying to steal elections. I think fake news and its effects are powerful, but also much more sophisticated and a little bit more subtle than that.
We're here today to discuss online imposters and disinformation. Researchers generally define misinformation as information that is false but promulgated with sincerity by a person who believes it is true. Disinformation, on the other hand, is shared with the deliberate intent to deceive.
Members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. As you know, this problem is nuanced and complex. I've been looking at disinformation campaigns for many years. I want to highlight that while we tend to focus on fake content, the most sophisticated actors I have seen operate online actually tend to use authentic content weaponized against their targets. Today, I think there's so many different ways that an organized group can manipulate a conversation. What we use internally is called the ABC framework. And basically what it says is there are 3 different ways in which something could be disinformation. It can be disinformation because it's deceptive actors, right? Perhaps it looks like it's a just normal activist, but in reality it's a Russian military officer. That's a deceptive actor. Or it could be disinformation because of a deceptive behavior, right? Perhaps the actor is exactly who they say they are, but the way the campaign is amplified, the way the message is amplified, is what makes it disinformation. That's when you use a troll farm in order to flood the internet with messages to make it look like there's some collective action, but really there is not, right? It's coordinated. And then there's C for content. Sometimes the content itself is deceptive, right? It could be a fake image, or it could be a fake video, something in which the content itself is the vector for deception. So in reality, it's a lot of different ways to do disinformation.
In the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, the United States is headed into what could be one of the most extraordinary years of claims and counterclaims, misinformation, and a renewed public perception that our democracy and truth itself are under attack.
When we asked Americans about made-up news themselves, is that 50% say that it's a very big problem facing the country today. And that places it above things like the environment or terrorism or some of these other major issues. So they definitely see it as a very big problem. They think it's getting in the way of the country being able to function well, of leaders being able to effectively make decisions and do their work, of Americans being able to stay informed about current events.
This is not a simple problem, and it's not a new problem. It's the problem that so much of democratic political theory in its 2,000 plus years has been devoted to addressing.
Of malicious fake news.
We know that the Russians were promulgating fake news through Facebook and other outlets.
The expression fake news is a terrible expression and should never be used. Fake news suggests that there's some new thing that wasn't there before. What we face is the problem of propaganda. Propaganda as a concept begins at the very beginning of discussions of democratic political philosophy. In the 20th century, we have propaganda arising in the First World War. In wartime, propaganda is always needed in order to represent the enemy as some sort of uncommon villain that is so beyond the pale and so fearsome that you need to risk your life in order to protect your family. Then we have the National Socialists who turned propaganda into an art form. So the problem of propaganda has always been central to any discussion of democracy, because democracy allows people to say what they want. Plato, in Book 8 of the Republic, says that democracy will lead immediately to tyranny, because democracy has at its core freedom of speech. You can't have democracy without the freedom of speech. How do we deal with this? Consistently with remaining a democracy. So this is the central problem of democracy.
We can actually remove a lot of the partisan politics from this and say it's not about the left, it's not about the right, it's about being able to trust your sources of information.
The public puts most of that onus on journalists and the news media to sort of solve that problem of made-up news, although most of the public thinks it will get worse over the next 5 years than think it will get better.
Decades earlier, we could all rely on and trust the fact that what news anchors were telling us on television was socially accepted fact. But with the rise of social media and going from Web 1.0 to 2.0 to Web 3.0, where anyone can create a social footprint that mirrors that of a media organization, the ability to trust that information is almost completely lost on us.
This program is made possible with support from Connecticut Humanities.